Welcome to Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape podcast, hosted by Dr. Erin Phillips, Director of Cross-Cutting Programs and Acting Senior Director of Research at the University of Wyoming School of Energy Resources. The show highlights SER's role in supporting our mission to promote energy-driven economic development in the state of Wyoming.
Thank you for joining us today on Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape. Today we have some special guests from the research team at the School of Energy Resources, Tara Righetti and Scarlett Forrest. They're experts in the legal analysis that accompanies the development of energy and natural resources and the utilization of the subsurface. So we're going to start with you today, Tara. You've joined us on the podcast before in episode 5, and you talked about the School of Energy Resources Nuclear Energy Research Center that you co-direct with Dr. Caleb Hill. And this is a great opportunity to highlight that you wear many different hats here at the University of Wyoming. You're a tenured professor of law and teach in both the School of Energy Resources and the College of Law. You are the Occidental Chair in Energy and Environmental Policies, a co-director of the Nuclear Energy Research Center, and more recently you created and direct the Jurisprudence of Underground Law and Energy Research Group, or JOULE, which is a very clever play on energy units. So Tara, will you please tell us a little bit about why you established JOULE and what it set out to accomplish?
Thanks so much, Erin, for that great introduction. We established JOULE because we saw a need for more policy-oriented legal research, as well as a need for capacity to contribute to the rest of SER's research program. So JOULE has two main thrusts. The first part of our mission is to develop and lead novel research related to Wyoming's energy and mining sectors and industrial sectors. And the second is to build capacity among stakeholders in law and policy topics related to land, subsurface resources, CCUS, and nuclear. We do that both by supporting SER's technical teams through preparation of things like legal and regulatory plans, developing and leading new funding proposals that are focused on legal and social science research, and then working through communities by providing outreach materials, and then in academia and government, both through peer-reviewed journal and law review publications, and then doing outreach like CLE, public presentations, research reports.
Excellent. So as you know, and as our listeners know, I'm a geologist by training. So I'm interested in diving a little bit deeper here. You really work at the intersection of law and technology and geology. So how does JOULE translate those complex geological realities like pore space into legal frameworks that policymakers can actually use?
One of the things that I love about this work is that JOULE gets to look at the intersection of physical systems like geology, hydrology, and other natural resources, and social systems like law, policy, and governance. And so energy and industrial uses of the subsurface involve this intersection of private law through rules like trespass and public law, such as Class 6 regulations that are used for underground injections of CO2. And together, these create governance systems that have to both provide certainty to industry and also protect Wyoming values.
Excellent. It just is a really interesting place to be working in this time, I think. Well, thanks for that, Tara. And now I'd like to turn to Scarlett. We know a little bit about JOULE now. And Scarlett, you're an assistant research scientist in JOULE. Please tell our listeners a little bit about your background and what drew you to this research role.
Thank you, Erin. I have a background working in an environmental and engineering and consulting firms for about 5 years. And then I went to law school in 2021, and I decided to go to the University of Wyoming because of how the state has all of these environmental and natural and energy resources in this state, and it's such a leader in the country. And then what drew me into this research role is I used to work a lot with geologists and engineers and all that sort of stuff, and so it's very exciting to be able to do that again and then bring the legal background that I have to kind of bridge that gap. And yeah.
Excellent. Thanks for that introduction, Scarlett. So Tara, I'd like to return to you and talk about some of the things that JOULE is working on. JOULE has been involved in new extractives like critical minerals from coal-related feedstocks and waste rock piles, as well as the uses of pore space for carbon storage. So what sort of legal issues are accompanying these emerging uses?
One of the challenges of new emerging uses is that you have to apply frameworks that were developed around conventional resource extraction to new technologies and new resources. So part of what JOULE does is look at laws like unitization, which have been used for a really long time in the oil and gas industry, and think about what are similar ways to amalgate interests in pore space that would allow for field-wide development of carbon storage projects. So often the governance problem that you're trying to address is very similar, but because the resource or technology is different, you need to adjust those tools to fit. Another example would be, for example, the 1872 mining law, which was put in place really during the period of westward expansion to encourage development of hard rock mineral resources. Now we're looking at critical minerals that are embedded in other waste streams like produced water, like coal. And we have to think about, okay, who owns those resources? Who has the right to develop them? How should those uses then be regulated? How can we make sure that law is a tool that allows the safe and responsible development of these resources as opposed to being an impediment?
Yeah, thank you for that answer. I mean, I think that with all of these energy sectors, they're so multidisciplinary. I mean, not just technical. We have legal questions and we have social questions, and all of those are equally important. All right, so Tara and Scarlett, beyond the subsurface for storage or for the extraction of fossil fuels or critical minerals, JOULE is also involved in the nuclear energy legal space. With Wyoming pursuing advanced reactors like the TerraPower Natrium plant near Kemmerer, Wyoming, what is the primary legal challenge your group is focusing on in the nuclear sector right now? And I'll ask Tara that question first.
JOULE has been engaged in a few different projects over the past couple of years to push into the nuclear space, particularly with a focus on law and policy. So one of our projects has looked at the siting procedures for new nuclear facilities, examining both the NRC's federal process, but also looking at state and local processes in Wyoming. We've also done some work really looking at the licensing frameworks for advanced reactors, particularly the change in NRC regulations that Congress directed through the ADVANCE Act, and how that process can be made more adaptable and more efficient. And then the third prong of our research is really focused on the waste streams that are produced by nuclear technologies and uses.
All right, thanks, Tara. So Scarlett, let's turn to you now. And I know you've done a lot of work in this space recently. And as Wyoming considers expanding its participation in the nuclear sector, the issue of nuclear waste has become a subject of debate. What should our listeners know about nuclear waste to participate in these conversations?
Thanks, Erin. Well, I think the first thing that everybody should know is that you cannot have nuclear power without a place to put the waste. There are advanced reactors coming out that might change the status quo, but for the most part, all nuclear power plants have to store their waste on site so that it can cool and radioactively decay enough for it to safely be transported off site. So essentially, if you banned nuclear waste or spent nuclear fuel, which is the resulting waste from nuclear power plants, that's high-level waste, if you ban that, you essentially ban nuclear power plants in the state as well. There is a downside here, which I know that we will get into more detail with in the following questions, but there are no permanent repositories, not one in the United States. So on-site storage has been the default for these nuclear power plants that have been operating over the past several decades. There's good news to this. The good news is that the United States has been very successful at storing waste safely on site. Our current process has been demonstrated to be safe over the years with the different safety monitoring that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission does. And that the other thing that Wyoming communities should consider is that producing power almost always generates some form of waste. I know most people in Wyoming know that well. So for example, with coal burning power plants, those generate fly ash, sludge, waste gas. wind facilities produced waste when the blades and wind turbines are decommissioned, and nuclear power plants generate spent fuel. So the good news with all of this is radioactive waste, nuclear waste, is the most intensely regulated waste stream from the energy sector.
Certainly, Wyoming is familiar with waste from the energy and extractive sectors, but nuclear power generation and the spent fuel that nuclear power generates are new. What are the NRC requirements?
The NRC safety requirements provide radiation exposure thresholds and safeguards to prevent releases of radiation into the environment and prevent exposure to the community around them. The radiation exposure thresholds, which kind of sounds like very technical, but in a simplified way, they are like an annual dose limit that facilities cannot exceed for workers or the public. Just to kind of simplify things and to put these radiation exposure limits into perspective, when you get one full body CT scan, you're actually getting 10 times the dose that you would get as a community hosting that they would get over a year.
Thanks for that comparison, Scarlett. That's really helpful. And just to kind of continue on this topic, we do want to acknowledge that spent nuclear fuel is a very controversial topic. And today we're really focusing our discussion specifically on the legal aspects of this topic that JOULE is analyzing. And as you mentioned, Scarlett, the United States is currently storing its spent nuclear fuel at over 70 sites nationwide because we lack a permanent federal repository. JOULE analyzed a U.S. Supreme Court case that examined a challenge to a proposed spent nuclear facility last year. How did that case address the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's authority to license consolidated interim storage facilities?
So to answer this question, there is a little bit of background that I think is important. There are different types of storage facilities or potential storage facilities that can store spent nuclear fuel or SNF. So the first one that we've talked about is the on-site interim storage. And that storage is at or near the land surface typically. And then what you mentioned and what was the subject of this case are consolidated interim storage facilities. So these are still interim storage, and they would store waste at the land surface or near the land surface, but it would collect waste from multiple operating and decommissioned reactor sites in one place, and it's an away from reactor facility, so it is not on site with a nuclear power plant. And basically a SIF would hold the SNF until it could be moved into a permanent repository. And then there's the permanent repository, which we've kind of touched on. And a permanent repository would store the SNF in a deep underground geological repository, which is widely considered the safest and best option for permanent disposal.
Thanks for taking the time to differentiate between potential storage options, since on-site, away from reactor, and geologic repository options can get confused. What issue was the court looking at regarding consolidated interim storage facilities?
The issue raised in the case before the Supreme Court addressed and this is the substantive issue, it addressed the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's authority to license a consolidated interim storage facility at all. So challengers to the license said that the two statutes, the Atomic Energy Act and the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, do not give the Nuclear Regulatory Commission this authority. However, the Supreme Court never reached the substantive issue. They decided the case on standing grounds, but they did provide some dicta that could be kind of a peek into what the Supreme Court is thinking, in which they said that the NRC does have this authority, and this is based on the history with how they've promulgated their regulations. And then the other thing is the 10th Circuit, which is where Wyoming sits, they have issued a binding opinion that the NRC does have this authority.
What was the court's holding in terms of jurisdictional issue you mentioned, Tara?
In Texas v. NRC, the court was resolving a very narrow issue resulting from a circuit split in two separate cases arising out of Texas and New Mexico. The primary issue was whether the court had jurisdiction to hear challenges to NRC licensing decisions under the Hobbs Act. The Hobbs Act provides Court of Appeals with jurisdiction to review NRC orders, but requests for review can only be brought by what the statute defines as parties aggrieved. The Supreme Court found that to be a party aggrieved, the petitioner must first have been a party in interest, meaning someone who properly raised a technical convention in the underlying NRC proceeding.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tara. So I want to return to the longer-term issue of a permanent repository. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act from 1982 is the foundation for managing spent fuel, but despite having a clear statutory mandate, the Department of Energy has not yet cited a permanent repository so that it can take responsibility for spent fuel. Why is that, Scarlett?
So this has a historical component is the answer. So the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, as you said, was initially passed in 1982. 5 years later, in 1987, Congress amended it and limited the Department of Energy to developing a permanent repository at Yucca Mountain, which is in Nevada, about 90 miles from Las Vegas. This never came to be, and it was not because the site lacked technical suitability or even lacked local community support, but its federal delegation and at the state level, it lacked support. And through various campaigning and things like that, eventually in 2012, the DOE shifted its approach away from Yucca Mountain into approaching to site of permanent repository using consent-based siting approach.
That's an interesting pivot. What is the status of those efforts now, Tara?
The Trump administration has moved the focus to what it has referred to as collaboration-based siting. Last week, the Department of Energy released a request for information to U.S. states regarding potential establishment of what it's calling nuclear life cycle innovation campuses. This concept focuses on co-locating key elements of the nuclear value chain, which could include activities like fuel fabrication, conversion, enrichment, as well as activities like reprocessing and waste disposition. The DOE in this request for information is asking states to tell it their priorities and other information relevant to these campuses. So this marks even another pivot in efforts to cite a permanent repository or other consolidated storage options. But even if these efforts are successful, the Nuclear Waste Policy Act still mandates storage at Yucca Mountain. So before the DOE could proceed with a new location or with one of these campuses, Congress would still need to amend the NWPA.
Okay. Well, let's drill down a little bit more there. What is the difference between having the legal authority to build a facility, which I understand would require both state and federal authorizing legislation, and the social authority?
As Scarlett mentioned, getting social support for citing a permanent repository has been an intractable issue for nearly 30 years. These facilities must be engineered to last millennia and will likely require construction over a period of as long as a decade. So social license can't just be a one-time thing. Maintaining that license requires trust, transparency, and accountability. These projects are also not exclusively a matter of local concern, but are important to state interests and other stakeholders. To make this happen, it requires shared purpose and mutual commitment at numerous scales to assure that the project delivers lasting benefits.
All right, thanks for that, Tara. So let's talk about Wyoming a little bit in this context. Tara, Wyoming has a state law that bans commercial spent fuel storage, with one major exception allowing nuclear power generators within the state to store their own spent fuel on site. What considerations should Wyoming lawmakers consider as they debate whether to expand this exemption to include other forms of storage?
I first think it's essential to re-emphasize what you just said. Currently, Wyoming law would not permit either a consolidated interim storage facility, like that at issue in the NRC v. Texas case, or a permanent repository to be constructed in the state. Those kinds of projects, none of which are currently proposed, can only move forward with legislative authorization. As Scarlett described, storage of spent nuclear fuel has been done safely for a long time, including at the DOE's waste isolation pilot plant in New Mexico, where non-commercial wastes are stored, and is one of the most highly regulated activities. So the question of how to regulate for health and safety isn't really a state concern. Instead, lawmakers should consider whether Wyoming's participation in the waste side of the nuclear life cycle could add value to the state through revenue or jobs, or support the other nuclear industries that it's been actively developing, as well as considering how participating in creating a waste solution could impact, whether positively or negatively, other Wyoming values.
All right. Thanks, Tara, and thanks, Scarlett, for that really comprehensive look at the legal complexities around nuclear energy and spent nuclear fuel. And I'd like to shift gears here a little bit and talk about some of the other things that JOULE has going on. I know you have collaborations reaching as far as Europe, including the University of Po in France. So what can Wyoming learn from European subsurface laws and nuclear energy development? And conversely, what is the world learning from Wyoming? And Tara, I'll pose that one to you.
It's just been so fun working with folks internationally and sharing what we're doing in Wyoming as well as learning from them. Energy transitions are in place at all times. They've been ongoing really since the beginning of human society, and they're continuing. And so in some places, Wyoming is really pioneering in these areas. Onshore CCUS is something that hasn't been done in Europe. Things like white hydrogen or geologic hydrogen exploration is something that is emerging as an opportunity there that we've also studied. And advanced reactors, for the most part, haven't been built there either. And so working with colleagues at European universities, we can share some of what we're doing in Wyoming, what's been working here, the way that our legal frameworks are developing. And then additionally, I think there's a lot that we can learn from Europe. With our collaborations in France, France has the greatest percentage of their total energy generation capacity from nuclear. It's very much embedded in the society there. I think we can learn from that. And then some of the work that I've done together with the Center for Global Studies, looking at collaborations in Scotland, in France, looking at Germany as well. I think we can see the labor and economic development policies that have been put in place as you transition between primary energy resources that then allow for growth and prosperity and that support both the state fiscal health as well as the workforce.
All right. So lots of opportunities to learn in the international space as well. And I know JOULE also does a lot of work with our students here at the University of Wyoming. So for a student listening who might be interested in law and or energy, what kind of hands-on work do they get to do with you? And, for example, are they drafting policy briefs? Are they analyzing case law? And I'll start with you, Scarlett, and the work that you've been doing with some of our students.
Yeah, so it's been very exciting. I've gotten to work with a law student and an undergraduate student on a comprehensive 50-state survey of states' hydrogen laws. So they were the first boots on the ground to kind of do that data collection and look at different states and use legal databases to find that research, but also looking through state websites and things like that. So but that research is very important and a big part of what we do. So they kind of get to directly, at least in this case, kind of take a first pass at exactly what I'm doing. So
yeah, it's exciting work. Yeah. So Tara, do you want to talk about some of your work with our students?
I've really enjoyed the opportunity to work with SER's students in our professional land management program, as well as with some of the students at the College of Law. So we have students that are contributing to some of our DOE projects. There's a student right now who's developing a right-of-way acquisition plan for a potential CO2 pipeline. That's part of a FEED study. I have students who are doing research on some of the changes in federal permitting for oil and gas development, including the changes under the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, looking at some of the decommissioning policies. I think really what is valuable about this is the opportunity to bring students in, to teach them core research and legal analysis capacities or develop those capabilities that then will position them to contribute and to support Wyoming industries and businesses, or really the energy sector nationwide, especially with new and emerging uses, and thinking about critically about these issues and how governance frameworks need to function.
Well, it sounds like you have a lot of exciting work going on for our students as well. And the last thing that I would like to touch on here is some of your work with community engagement. So Tara, JOULE's research also, touches on the social side of what we do here at the School of Energy Resources. Will you talk a little bit about JOULE's efforts in publishing community and landowner guides for various energy technologies?
This has really been a passion project for me, and it's something that I love working on in JOULE. I think Wyoming communities are highly adept at addressing and thinking about energy issues, but there's a need for accessible and neutral information about these emerging technologies. In some cases, right, they're new uses to Wyoming, but they're also new uses globally and nationwide because Wyoming's a pioneer in energy. And so something that we've really tried to do is to take this information, particularly a lot of the research that's been done in the field, but also at the School of Energy Resources, and distill it into an accessible format that communities and landowners can use. So far we have 2 of these guides. The first one is a guide to landowners on pore space and carbon storage. Something we recognized early on is that to develop out a CCUS project, you're going to need a lot of subsurface pore space rights and storage rights. Per Wyoming law, those are owned by the surface owner, who may in some cases not have a lot of experience having negotiated these types of agreements or agreements for minerals. And so what we wanted to do is talk about what are the purposes of this, what do these agreements look like, what their rights are. We've developed something very similar in the context of CO2 pipelines. What should communities think about as they think about CO2 pipelines coming through their communities? How are those regulated? What safety measures are in place? And then as landowners, when they get asked to grant a right-of-way for a CO2 pipeline, what should they be thinking about? We have 2 that will be coming out in the next year that Scarlett's really been leading. One of those is a guide to how to participate in nuclear facility siting procedures. It talks about how do you get involved at the Industrial Siting Commission or the DEQ or participate in an NRC licensing proceeding? How do we make and take away some of the opacity in these procedures? And then the second thing that Scarlett's been working on is a guide to Wyoming citizens about nuclear waste and how it is regulated and what they should know as communities, what's already happening and what could be in Wyoming's future.
Excellent. Those sound like really valuable resources, and we encourage our listeners to seek those out on the JOULE website that you can find through the School of Energy Resources. So we have spent our time today really digging into some complex legal and policy topics that impact the entire nation. But as we wrap up here, I would like to bring it back to Wyoming and end on a personal note, as we always do on this podcast. So I'd like to ask each of you, where is your favorite place in Wyoming and why? So Scarlett, let's start with you.
Yeah, so my favorite place in Wyoming is the Snowy Range Mountains, especially around Medicine Bow Peak. That area, that outdoor recreation area, I had no idea it existed before moving here, and it was a real treat to kind of like drive up through it and see how, I just find that area to be very beautiful. Yeah.
Agreed. Mm-hmm. One of my favorite places too. How about you, Tara?
I love the Wind River Range. That's a place that I've loved exploring myself, and that most recently I've had the opportunity to now share it and explore it with my son. So we got to climb Gannett Peak together last summer, which was a really incredible adventure. And it's so rewarding to see my children also developing this love and appreciation for Wyoming's open spaces.
Great. Also one of my favorites. So thanks again so much, Tara and Scarlett, for joining us and for all of the incredible work that you're doing to advance legal research in the energy field here in Wyoming and more. And as always, thank you to our listeners, and tune in next time. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape, the podcast that highlights the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. You can expect a new episode of Energy Frontier every other Wednesday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. See you next time.